Okay, it's about 1:30 p.m. Pacific time on Friday, June 27th, and I'm just now getting around to filming content. I spent a lot of time on Blue Sky this morning. If you don't follow me over there, please do. I talk about a lot of things that I don't necessarily talk about on TikTok or YouTube. I actually made a conscious choice not to make any content around the Supreme Court rulings from today. And I want to talk about my perspective on it because, as I was on Blue Sky, and actually, as I was reading YouTube comments from videos that I posted early this morning and had filmed late last night, I noticed people were spiraling really, really hard, really, really rapidly because the news from SCOTUS is not good, right? And I think it's easy for people to go to a very dark place very, very quickly. And I want to talk about why I think it's important that we set limits to how much content we are willing to consume about what today in particular the Supreme Court has done, but in general what the fascists are doing. And I said this like way back in January, February, that in permaculture, the third ethic was originally set limits to consumption. Now we call it fair share. But I think that we have done a disservice to everybody by transforming that ethic from set limits to consumption to just this general like fair share, or some people say future care. I think that makes that ethic less than what it should be. When we say set limits to consumption, that is not only for the betterment of other people, it's not only to make sure that other people in the planet get their fair share. Before all the awfulness of this regime, one of the things I talked about frequently on TikTok was setting healthy boundaries with toxic family members, right? And how that is a measure that we implement to protect ourselves. And a boundary is not you dictating to somebody else what they are going to do. It's not you demanding certain behaviors of other people. What it is, sorry, I almost knocked my yarn over and then almost knocked my phone over just there. What it is it is saying, there is a limit, there's a boundary I'm not willing to cross, right? So if I am being exposed to toxic behavior, if I'm being exposed to something that is harming me personally, whether that is a physical threat or a psychological threat, right? I am going to choose to remove myself from the situation. Our power in those situations is not to demand other people change their behavior. We can only control ourselves. We can't control what is happening in the world. We can only control ourselves and our reaction to it. So when we're dealing with a toxic relative, setting a boundary is saying, if you engage in certain behaviors, I'm going to leave the room. I'm going to leave the event. I'm going to have to take a break from interacting with you. And I think that is a tactic that we should employ when we are looking at the news right now, especially today. We know that content that really catastrophizes the headlines, content that makes things seem incredibly urgent, really scary, really devastating, and makes them seem more extreme than they actually are. Or maybe it's appropriately terrible news and you just see headline after headline after headline after headline with the same news and you just feel really bombarded. We know that is a psychological tactic that the Trump regime and like all authoritarian regimes employ. It is that flood the zone. It's the shock and awe. It's the wanting to demoralize you by inundating you with horrible, horrible thing after horrible, horrible thing, right? They want to make it so that things feel worse than they are, so that all you hear is bad news, so that you feel completely overwhelmed by it, and then you become paralyzed. You stop fighting. They want to make it seem like their horrible fascist agenda is an inevitability, right? And so they employ these psychological tactics to trick your brain into thinking that it is an inevitability. And it's really important that we understand that's what they're doing to us, that we understand that that is part of their game, that's part of their warfare, that's part of the strategy that they are using to try and take over. And so we have to get ahead of that. We have to make sure that we protect ourselves, defend ourselves from it, that we don't let ourselves be susceptible to those tactics. Making a conscious choice to set limits about how much awfulness you are willing to absorb in a day, how many terrible headlines you are willing to read, that is a conscious act of resistance. That is you being strategic, that is you being savvy, that is preserving your ability to engage in this work. That is something that I think more and more of us need to be choosing on a daily basis. We need to be choosing to set limits to how much we are willing to be psychologically impacted, how much we are willing to expose ourselves to the tactics of the regime. That is good for us as individuals, and it is good for democracy, for us to understand what they are trying to do and then to refuse to let it work on us. what I said on Blue Sky this morning, and at this moment it's pinned at the top of my account, is if binging news about our corrupt Christo-fascist Supreme Court ruling in alignment with their unitary executive theory Christo-fascist ideals is stressing you out, if what you have heard in the news from the Supreme Court is stressing you out and causing you to spiral, right, get off the internet. Please, please get off the internet. Set limits to your consumption of news that sends you into a spiral. If you feel that the Trump regime's tactics are working on you, if you start to feel demoralized, if you start to feel that it's hopeless, if you feel your cortisol levels skyrocketing, if you feel your anxiety going through the roof so that you just like sit and you can't function, right? Then you need to stop. You need to stop consuming this stuff. The defense of democracy happens in the real world, and it also happens in our heads at the same time. Now, somebody in the comments of that post said, ignoring them and checking out won't mean you won't be affected later. Feels like delaying the inevitable. No. So this is what we call Waffles and Pancakes discourse. I said, set limits to how much of this stuff you are willing to consume so that you do not become demoralized and give up the fight. That is not the same thing as saying, hide your head in the sand and pretend that it's not going to affect you. We need to read the news. I've said time and time and time again, we need to bear witness to what is happening. That is not the same thing as marinating in negative news stories, as sitting there and letting it just wash over you time and time and time again until you feel completely paralyzed and you give up. I mean, going to quote myself here, and I know this may sound a little bit harsh, but I said consciously choosing to marinate in bad news to the point of demoralization and paralysis is self-indulgent. It doesn't help you and it doesn't help democracy. I know I've talked about this extensively in the past, but doomerism is very freeing. It's very comforting. It's the lazy way out. It says, well, I don't have to do anything now because it's inevitable. Trump is inevitable, so I don't have to act. I don't have to fight. I can just give up and let fascism roll on in. Doomerism is a very comfortable, privileged position to take up. We need our eyes on the prize right now a little bit. Are our energies, are our focus furthering our goal, or are they hampering our goal? If you are marinating in those news stories, are you getting closer to defending democracy, or are you letting the psychological tactics of the Trump regime work on you, and are you getting closer to giving up? Right, what does Matthew say in the New Testament? Who by worrying can add 1 cubit to their stature? Who by worrying can add 1 day to their life? Folks in my comments said, rather than reading the news stories over and over again, rather than watching all of those YouTube videos and reading all of those blog posts where folks are catastrophizing and engaging in doomerism, how about you call your representatives in Congress? Because you know who else is catastrophizing right now? You know who else is freaking the fuck out right now? Republicans in Congress, because the big, nasty, bloated budget bill is in trouble, and we need to keep the pressure on. Republicans are really starting to waffle, and what is one of our goals as part of the resistance? What is one of our major goals is to get those pillars of support under the Trump regime to crumble. We need them to be waffling. We need them to withdraw their support. So if you are tempted to be paralyzed, if you are tempted to engage in consuming too much of the unhealthy, negative content that is out there right now, then I would just really encourage you to set that limit for yourself, pivot, and do something else. Maybe it's something like knitting. Maybe it's something like working in the garden today. My husband is out working on our greenhouse because that is what is good for his mental health right now, right? Maybe it is doing something like, what are the pro-democracy actions that I can engage in that will further our cause? Maybe it is calling our electeds. Maybe it is attending an event near you. Maybe it is doing some kind of mutual aid work to care for your neighbors, to care for your community. What can you engage in that not only makes you feel empowered, but furthers the cause of democracy? Please, 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 for your own personal mental well-being, as well as your longevity and efficacy in the pro-democracy movement, set limits to how much of this stuff you want to consume. Or not even want to. It may feel like you cannot help yourself, but keep doom scrolling, right? It may feel like it's hard to peel yourself away. Set a limit. Say, I'm only going to read 2 news stories on this topic today, and then I'm done. I understand the issues. I don't need to read any more analysis about this. I don't need to watch any more 25-minute long YouTube videos where people are spiraling, because all that does is make me spiral, and it doesn't further the cause of democracy. Setting boundaries is a very effective form of resistance. So please, please do that for yourself today. I'm actually going to spend the rest of the day talking about other news stories. I don't actually think I'm going to cover any of the SCOTUS rulings for a couple of days. Please take care of yourselves, because we all have a lot of really worthy work that we need to be engaging in.